Victoria Blackwood insisted I had no right to attend my own husband's will reading. Family only, she declared, with that icy smile of hers. I quietly agreed and stayed home, thinking I knew my place. But hidden in Harrison's desk drawer was a document that would shatter everything they believed about family bloodlines.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
The September rain drummed against the black umbrella as I watched my husband's casket being lowered into the rich Connecticut soil. 31 years of marriage, and here I stood at Greenwood Cemetery, feeling like a stranger at my own tragedy. Victoria, Harrison's older sister, positioned herself at the head of the grave like she was presiding over the ceremony. Her perfectly coiffed silver hair caught the dim light as she leaned toward Blake, Harrison's younger brother, whispering something that made him glance at me with unmistakable disdain. Some people just don't understand their place in times like these, Victoria had announced earlier, her voice carrying just far enough for the entire front row of mourners to hear. Her words cut through the humid air like a blade. Harrison would want his real family to handle the important matters now. I adjusted the black Chanel dress Harrison had surprised me with for our last anniversary, just 8 months ago. Back then, he'd fastened the pearl necklace around my neck himself, kissing the nape as he whispered how elegant I looked. Now that same dress felt like armor made of paper, completely inadequate against the arrows of contempt his family kept launching in my direction. The funeral director approached after the service, his clipboard damp from the persistent drizzle. "Mrs. Blackwood, there are several administrative matters we need to discuss regarding the final arrangements." "Oh, she won't be handling any of that," Victoria interrupted smoothly, stepping between us like a well-dressed sentinel. Her designer handbag gleamed despite the weather. "The family will take care of all business matters from this point forward." I opened my mouth to protest, but the director looked genuinely confused, his eyes darting between Victoria's commanding presence and my uncertain expression. Victoria's smile never wavered, all polished teeth and practiced warmth that never quite reached her steel-gray eyes. "Elena, dear," she continued, placing a manicured hand on my shoulder with just enough pressure to feel patronizing, "you've been through such tremendous stress these past few weeks. Let us handle the complicated family business. You should focus on your own healing." That phrase echoed in my mind as I drove home alone to the modest townhouse Harrison and I had shared since his retirement. Your own healing, as if grief was something I should do separately from his family, in isolation, while they managed the real family affairs. The funeral had been a carefully orchestrated performance where I played the role of grieving widow, while Victoria played the part of responsible family matriarch. Every interaction had been designed to reinforce the hierarchy that had existed throughout my marriage. Harrison's blood family at the top, making decisions and controlling narratives, while I occupied a lower tier, grateful for whatever consideration they chose to offer. I remembered how Victoria had even dictated the funeral arrangements without consulting me. "We know what Harrison would have wanted," she'd said, when I'd suggested including a reading from his favorite Thoreau essay. "Let's keep things traditional and appropriate for the family name." The message was clear. I might have been his wife, but I wasn't really family in the way that mattered. The next few weeks blurred together in a haze of Victoria treating Harrison's Riverside Drive mansion like her personal command center. I'd stopped visiting after the third day, when I found her systematically going through Harrison's private study, sorting his papers into neat piles on the mahogany desk where he'd spent countless evenings reading financial reports and classic literature. "These estate documents are incredibly complex," she'd said, without looking up from a stack of investment portfolios. "Thank goodness Harrison had family who understands these sophisticated financial matters." I'd stood frozen in the doorway of what had been my second home for 3 decades, watching this woman reorganize my husband's private world as if I'd never existed. The worst part wasn't her cruelty, it was how natural she made it appear, how easily she assumed authority over everything Harrison had built. But it was the personal touches that hurt most deeply. Victoria had immediately removed the framed photographs of Harrison and me from the mantelpiece, replacing them with formal family portraits that featured his parents, siblings, and cousins, images from before I'd entered the picture. Our wedding photo, which had sat prominently on his desk for 31 years, had been relocated to a drawer. When I asked about it, Victoria had shrugged dismissively. We're trying to create a more appropriate atmosphere for the family meetings. Some things are just too personal for business discussions. The gathering started the following week. Victoria would arrive each morning in her pearl-white Mercedes, armed with expensive coffee and her ever-present clipboard, ready to host what she called family meetings. I'd drive past sometimes during my grocery runs, counting the luxury cars crowding the circular driveway. Voices and laughter would drift from the tall windows, sounds of celebration that felt obscene so soon after Harrison's death. Once, I spotted Grace Pemberton, who owned the antique shop downtown, carrying an ornate silver tea service up the front steps, the same woman who'd helped Harrison and me select our wedding china 31 years ago. When I ran into her at the post office the following Tuesday, I waited for her to mention seeing me around the house or ask how I was managing. Instead, she'd patted my arm sympathetically and said, "Victoria mentioned you've been keeping to yourself lately. Probably wise, giving yourself space to process everything privately." The realization hit me like a physical blow. Victoria wasn't just excluding me from family decisions. She was actively rewriting the narrative of my relationship with Harrison, painting my absence as a choice rather than an exclusion. To the outside world, I was the grieving widow who preferred privacy, not the wife being systematically erased from her husband's legacy. That evening, I sat in my small townhouse, the place Harrison and I had planned to renovate once he fully retired from his investment firm, trying to remember the last time I'd felt genuinely welcome anywhere. Even during our marriage, family gatherings had felt like elaborate performances where I never quite knew my role. Harrison had always sensed my discomfort. He'd find ways to include me in conversations, squeeze my hand reassuringly when Victoria made one of her pointed observations about people who married into established families. "Don't let her intimidate you, Elena," he'd say afterward, pulling me close in the privacy of our bedroom. "You're my wife. That's the only thing that matters to me." But Harrison was gone now, and apparently his protection had died with him. The phone call about the will reading came on a Thursday morning while I was tending to the small herb garden on my kitchen windowsill, the one Harrison had helped me plant last spring when we talked about spending more time cooking together. Victoria's name appeared on my caller ID, and I almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. "Elena, sweetie." Her voice dripped with that particular brand of false concern she'd perfected over the years. "I wanted to give you advance notice about Monday's will reading appointment." My hand tightened around the phone. "What about it?" "Well, Marcus Thornfield will be meeting with the family to review Harrison's final wishes and testament. You know how these legal proceedings work. Very formal, very focused on blood relatives and legitimate inheritance matters." I set down my watering can carefully, processing her words. "Harrison was my husband, Victoria." "Of course he was, dear. But these readings are really about bloodline inheritance and family assets that have been in the Blackwood name for generations. Since you have your own place and your own life established, Marcus thought it might be less complicated for everyone if we handled the formal family proceedings first. You understand." The words hung in the humid kitchen air. Less complicated for them? What I didn't know, what I couldn't have possibly imagined as I agreed to stay away from my own husband's will reading, was that across town in a mahogany-paneled law office, everything I thought I understood about my place in the Blackwood family was about to change forever. The will reading took place at exactly 10 o'clock Monday morning in the prestigious law offices of Thornfield and Associates, located in the historic district of downtown Hartford. I knew this because Victoria had made sure to mention it during our phone conversation, describing the mahogany-paneled conference room and the impressive view of the Connecticut River as if she were inviting me to a social event I couldn't possibly appreciate. Marcus has such an elegant office, she'd said, with that particular tone she used when discussing things she considered beyond my understanding.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Very old world, very appropriate for handling serious family business. The kind of environment where important decisions get made by people who understand the weight of generational responsibility. While I sat in my modest townhouse kitchen that Monday morning, nursing my second cup of coffee and watching sparrows fight over seeds in my small backyard feeder, Victoria was orchestrating what she believed would be the most important morning of her life. She had arrived at the law office 30 minutes early, according to what I would later learn, wearing her most expensive navy Armani suit and carrying the leather portfolio that had belonged to Harrison's father. Blake had arrived precisely on time, looking uncomfortable in a suit that seemed too tight around his middle. At 58, Harrison's younger brother had never quite lived up to the family's expectations, bouncing between various business ventures that invariably required Harrison's financial intervention. But today, he carried himself with unusual confidence, probably anticipating that his long-awaited inheritance would finally give him the independence he'd never managed to achieve. Jasper Blackwood, Harrison's 73-year-old uncle, had made the drive down from his retirement community in Litchfield. Despite his age, his mind remained sharp, and he'd spent decades managing the family's various charitable foundations. He took his seat at the conference table with the dignity of someone who'd been participating in important family meetings for over half a century. Cordelia Ashworth, Harrison's cousin and the family's unofficial historian, had brought along a leather-bound notebook where she'd been documenting family genealogy for the past 15 years. She'd always been the most diplomatic of Harrison's relatives, often serving as a buffer between Victoria's intensity and everyone else's discomfort. But even Cordelia had accepted Victoria's explanation about my absence without question. Marcus Thornfield entered the conference room at precisely 10 o'clock, carrying the thick manila envelope that contained Harrison's last will and testament. At 62, Marcus had been handling Blackwood family legal matters for nearly 20 years, having taken over the account when his senior partner retired. He knew the family dynamics well enough to recognize the significance of my absence, but professional ethics prevented him from questioning Victoria's assertion that I had voluntarily declined to attend. "Good morning, everyone," Marcus began, settling into his chair at the head of the polished conference table. "Before we begin, I want to confirm that all interested parties are present. Mrs. Elena Blackwood was invited but has chosen not to attend today's reading." "That's correct," Victoria replied smoothly, her voice carrying just the right note of concerned understanding. Elena felt it would be too emotionally overwhelming to participate in the formal legal proceedings. She asked the family to handle everything on her behalf and update her afterward on any relevant details. Marcus made a note in his legal pad, though something about Victoria's explanation seemed to give him pause. In his 2 decades of practice, he'd rarely encountered a surviving spouse who voluntarily excluded themselves from a will reading, especially when the estate was as substantial as Harrison's. But Victoria's confidence was absolute, and she'd provided what seemed like a reasonable explanation. Blake nodded approvingly. Elena's always been sensitive about these kinds of formal family meetings. Harrison used to say she got overwhelmed by legal talk and financial planning discussions. This wasn't true, of course. I had a master's degree in art history and had spent 15 years managing the acquisitions budget for the Wadsworth Athenaeum before taking early retirement to care for Harrison during his illness. I'd been perfectly capable of understanding financial and legal documents, but Blake was repeating a narrative that Victoria had been crafting for years, that I was somehow intellectually unprepared for serious family business. "She's probably better off not being here anyway," Cordelia added, her voice gentle but reinforcing the same message. "These readings can be so formal and intimidating. Elena always seemed more comfortable with the social aspects of family life rather than the business side."
Jasper, who had always been fond of me during family gatherings, looked slightly troubled by my absence, but didn't challenge the group consensus. I suppose she knows what's best for herself during this difficult time, he said diplomatically.
Marcus cleared his throat and began the formal reading. The last will and testament of Harrison Charles Blackwood, dated March 15th of this year. He paused, noting the relatively recent date. Harrison had updated his will just 6 months before his death, though none of the family members seemed to find this timing significant. As Marcus read through the preliminary legal language, Victoria sat with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, occasionally nodding as if she were already familiar with the document's contents. She'd positioned herself directly across from the lawyer, establishing herself as the primary family representative. Blake sat to her right, while Cordelia and Jasper flanked them on either side, creating a unified family front around the conference table. The first shock came when Marcus began reading the specific bequests. To my beloved wife, Elena Maria Blackwood, I leave the entirety of my estate, including all real property, financial assets, business interests, personal effects, and any other holdings I may possess at the time of my death. The silence in the room was deafening. Victoria's composed expression flickered for just a moment before she leaned forward. I'm sorry, Marcus. Could you repeat that section? I think there might be some confusion about the primary beneficiaries. Marcus looked up from the document, his professional demeanor unchanged. There's no confusion, Mrs. Victoria Blackwood. The will is quite explicit. Elena Blackwood inherits the entire estate. Blake's face had gone pale. That can't be right. What about the family provisions, the trusts for the next generation, the charitable foundations? According to this will, Marcus continued, there are no other beneficiaries. Mrs. Elena Blackwood is the sole heir to everything. Victoria's carefully maintained composure began to crack. But she's not even here. She said she didn't want to be involved in family business. She voluntarily removed herself from consideration. Mrs. Victoria Blackwood said carefully, a person's presence or absence at a will reading doesn't affect their legal inheritance rights. Mrs. Elena Blackwood's decision not to attend today doesn't invalidate her position as the designated beneficiary. The room erupted in confused voices. Cordelia was asking about family heirlooms and charitable commitments. Blake was demanding to know when Harrison had made these changes. Jasper was questioning whether the will had been properly witnessed and notarized. But Victoria sat in stunned silence, her mind racing through the implications. If Elena inherited everything, then all of Victoria's assumptions about managing the family estate were completely wrong. The renovation plans she'd already begun discussing with contractors, the financial meetings she'd scheduled for later in the week, the authority she'd claimed over Harrison's business interests, none of it was legally valid. Marcus attempted to restore order to the meeting, but the family's shock was giving way to something much more dangerous, desperate confusion about what this meant for their futures and their assumptions about Elena's place in the family hierarchy. And while this chaos unfolded in the elegant conference room overlooking the Connecticut River, I sat in my kitchen, completely unaware that my entire world had just shifted beneath my feet. Monday passed in a strange, suspended quiet. I moved through my small townhouse like a ghost, unable to concentrate on anything meaningful. The herb garden Harrison had helped me plant sat neglected on the windowsill, the basil already showing signs of stress from my distracted care. I kept expecting the phone to ring with updates from the will reading, but as the hours stretched into evening, silence settled over everything like dust. By Tuesday morning, I'd convinced myself that the quiet was probably normal. Legal proceedings took time, and Victoria had made it clear that she would handle communicating any relevant information to me afterward. I tried to establish some kind of routine, making Harrison's favorite breakfast, scrambled eggs with chives from our garden, even though eating alone at our small kitchen table felt like performing grief for an audience of one. The first call came from Blake around noon. His voice carried an odd tension I hadn't heard since Harrison's diagnosis 6 months earlier. Elena, hi. I wanted to check in on you after yesterday's meeting with Marcus. He paused, and I could hear traffic in the background. How are you holding up? I'm managing, I replied, settling into Harrison's reading chair with my tea. Victoria said she'd update me on anything important. I assume everything went smoothly? Another pause, longer this time. Well, there were some unexpected developments. Nothing you need to worry about right now, but the family's going to need some time to work through the details. Something in his tone made my stomach tighten. What kind of unexpected developments? Just complicated legal stuff. You know how these estate matters can get tangled up in technical language and procedures. Victoria's handling it all very capably. The words sounded rehearsed, like he'd practiced them. The important thing is that you're taking care of yourself during this difficult transition. After he hung up, I sat staring at the phone, trying to decode what he hadn't said. In 31 years of family interactions, Blake had never been particularly articulate, but this conversation felt different, like he was working from a script someone else had written. Wednesday brought a visit from Cordelia, which surprised me because Harrison's cousin had never come to the townhouse alone before. She arrived just after lunch, carrying a casserole dish and wearing the kind of sympathetic expression people reserve for delivering bad news. I brought you some of my chicken and rice, she said, settling into the small living room that always made visitors from the mansion seem uncomfortably large. I thought you might not be cooking much for yourself these days. I accepted the dish gratefully, genuinely touched by the gesture. That's very thoughtful, Cordelia. How did the reading go yesterday? Blake mentioned there were some complications. Her face shifted almost imperceptibly. Oh, you know how these legal things can be. Lots of technical language and procedural requirements. Marcus had to explain several complex provisions that will take time to implement properly. But Harrison's wishes were clear, weren't they? He was always so organized about his paperwork. Of course. Harrison was very thorough. She twisted her wedding ring, a nervous habit I'd noticed during particularly tense family gatherings. It's just that some of the arrangements require additional documentation and verification processes. Victoria's coordinating with Marcus to make sure everything gets handled according to proper legal protocols. The phrase proper legal protocols sounded strange coming from Cordelia, who usually spoke in more casual, personal terms. But I nodded and thanked her for the casserole, accepting her explanation the same way I'd been accepting Victoria's authority for 3 decades. Thursday evening brought the most unsettling call of all, Victoria herself, her voice carrying a carefully controlled emotion I couldn't identify. Elena, dear, I hope you're finding ways to stay busy during this transition period. I know how difficult it can be when you're not actively involved in managing all the estate details. I appreciate you handling everything, I replied, though something about her tone made me uneasy. Is there anything specific I should know about? Well, there are some administrative matters that will require your signature eventually, but nothing urgent. Marcus wants to make sure all the documentation is properly prepared before involving you in any of the technical aspects. She paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. Elena, I want you to know that the family really appreciates how gracefully you've handled this whole situation. Your decision to step back and let us manage the complicated family business has made everything so much smoother for everyone involved. The word decision struck me as odd. I hadn't made a decision, so much as accepted an exclusion, but Victoria's tone suggested I'd been actively choosing to remain uninvolved. I just want to do whatever's best for everyone, I said, falling back on the diplomatic responses I'd perfected over decades of family interactions. That's exactly what I mean. You've always been so considerate about knowing your place in family matters. Harrison used to tell me how much he valued that quality in you. Your understanding that some things are better left to blood relatives who've been dealing with family business their whole lives. After she hung up, I sat in Harrison's chair for a long time, watching shadows lengthen across the small living room. Something felt fundamentally wrong about these conversations, but I couldn't identify exactly what it was. The family was handling Harrison's estate, just as they'd handled every other significant family matter during our marriage. I was being kept informed without being burdened with complicated details, just as they'd always done. But Harrison's words from our last evening together kept echoing in my mind. Don't let them make you feel invisible after I'm gone. Was this what he'd meant? This careful choreography of exclusion disguised as consideration? This systematic removal of me from decisions about our shared life, presented as protection from stress I supposedly couldn't handle? By Friday morning, I'd almost convinced myself I was being paranoid, reading too much significance into normal family grief processes. But deep in my chest, a small voice was beginning to whisper that something was very, very wrong with the story I was being told. I just didn't know yet how wrong it really was. The call came on Sunday afternoon while I was organizing Harrison's collection of vintage fountain pens, a task I'd been avoiding for weeks. Each pen carried memories: the Mont Blanc I'd given him for our 20th anniversary, the antique Waterman he'd inherited from his grandfather, the simple Parker he'd carried every day to work for 15 years. I was holding the Mont Blanc, remembering how his face had lit up when he'd unwrapped it, when my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Mrs. Blackwood, this is Marcus Thornfield, your husband's estate attorney." My stomach immediately clenched. Had Victoria complained about something? Had I somehow violated some protocol by not being more actively involved? "Mr. Thornfield, hello. If this is about my absence from Monday's reading, Victoria explained that the family felt it would be better if I—" "Mrs. Blackwood," his voice cut through my fumbling explanation with professional urgency that made me pause mid-sentence. "There has been a very serious misunderstanding that requires immediate clarification." The fountain pen slipped from my fingers, clattering onto the hardwood floor of Harrison's study. Something in Marcus's tone made the room feel suddenly cold. "What kind of misunderstanding?" "Mrs. Blackwood, you are the primary beneficiary of Harrison's entire estate. Everything: the Riverside Drive mansion, the investment portfolio worth approximately $3.7 million, the art collection, the business shares, his personal effects, all of it has been left to you as his spouse and chosen heir." The words didn't register immediately. I found myself staring at the wall where Harrison's diplomas hung in neat frames, trying to process each syllable like they were spoken in a foreign language. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "Every single asset, Mrs. Blackwood. Harrison's will is explicit and legally airtight. You inherit everything." My legs gave out, and I collapsed into Harrison's leather desk chair, the same chair where he'd spent countless evenings managing investments and reading. The room seemed to spin around me as Marcus Thornfield's words finally penetrated my shock. "That can't be right," I whispered. "Victoria said the reading was for blood family only. She said I didn't have any legitimate claim to family inheritance." "Mrs. Blackwood, I need you to understand something very clearly. There is no inheritance designated for Harrison's siblings or extended family members. The will names you as the sole beneficiary. There are no other heirs." My hands started trembling so violently I nearly dropped the phone. "But why didn't you tell me this on Monday? Why wasn't I included in the reading if I'm supposed to inherit everything?" Marcus Thornfield's voice shifted to something much more serious, tinged with what sounded like professional concern. "Mrs. Blackwood, I never spoke with you about Monday's reading. According to my records, Victoria Blackwood contacted my office last Tuesday claiming that you were too emotionally distraught to attend the formal proceedings." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the chest. She said what? "Mrs. Victoria Blackwood informed my secretary that you had specifically requested the family handle all estate matters on your behalf because you felt unable to cope with the legal and financial complexities during your grieving process." I stood up so abruptly that black spots danced across my vision. "Mr. Thornfield, I never said any of those things. Victoria called me Thursday morning and told me I wasn't welcome at the reading because I wasn't blood family." The silence on his end stretched uncomfortably long. When Marcus finally spoke again, his professional tone had shifted into something much more grave and troubled. Mrs. Blackwood, when I attempted to call you Monday morning to confirm this highly unusual arrangement, someone intercepted the call. The person who answered claimed to be speaking on your behalf and assured me that you preferred to receive all information secondhand to avoid additional emotional distress. The implications crashed over me in successive waves. Victoria hadn't just excluded me from the will reading, she had actively intercepted communications from Harrison's lawyer and lied about my wishes and mental state.
Mrs. Blackwood, I believe we have a very significant legal problem here, Marcus continued. Victoria Blackwood and the other family members left my office Monday afternoon under the completely false impression that they had inherited various portions of the estate. This misconception was based entirely on their belief that you had voluntarily removed yourself from consideration. My mouth had gone completely dry. They think they inherited Harrison's estate? Unfortunately, yes. And Mrs. Blackwood, there's something else you need to know immediately. According to my contacts in the local business community, Victoria has already begun making substantial financial commitments and legal arrangements based on this misunderstanding. The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of legal explanations and procedural details that I struggled to absorb. Marcus explained that Victoria had contacted Pemberton and Associates about renovating the mansion, scheduled appointments with 3 different financial advisory firms to discuss managing her new portfolio, and had even begun preliminary discussions about transferring property titles and insurance policies. Can she legally do any of those things? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. She has absolutely no legal authority to make any decisions regarding the estate, Marcus replied firmly. But what deeply concerns me is how quickly and confidently she's proceeding with these arrangements. This suggests she may have been planning this course of action for some time, possibly even before Harrison's death. What do you mean? Mrs. Blackwood, in my 23 years of estate law practice, I have never encountered a situation where someone moved this aggressively to assume control of assets they had no legal right to claim. The speed and organization of Victoria's actions suggest this wasn't a spontaneous decision made after Monday's reading. After Marcus hung up, I sat motionless in Harrison's study as the autumn afternoon faded into evening. The room felt different now. Not like a shrine to a lost husband, but like evidence of a deliberate theft that had been planned while Harrison was still alive. My husband hadn't just remembered me in his will, he had protected me, trusted me with everything he'd built over 73 years of life. And his own sister had tried to steal it all by convincing me I didn't deserve to even be present for the reading of his final wishes. Over the next 48 hours, Marcus Thornfield's investigation revealed the full scope of Victoria's calculated deception. His Tuesday morning call brought details that made my stomach churn with a mixture of rage and disbelief. Elena, I've reviewed all communications with my office from the past 2 weeks, Marcus began, his professional tone barely containing what sounded like controlled anger. Victoria didn't just intercept one phone call, she systematically intercepted every attempt I made to contact you directly. I gripped the phone tighter, sitting at my kitchen table, surrounded by the morning light that had once felt comforting, but now seemed to illuminate the extent of my naivete. How many times did you try to reach me? 7 separate attempts over 5 days. Each time, someone claiming to speak on your behalf assured my office that you were too emotionally fragile to handle direct communication about estate matters. The person, who I now realize was Victoria, provided increasingly detailed explanations about your supposed mental state. The betrayal cut deeper with each revelation. What kind of explanations? Marcus's voice grew more troubled. According to our phone logs, Victoria told my secretary that you had suffered what she called a complete emotional breakdown after Harrison's funeral. She claimed you had been hospitalized briefly for severe depression and anxiety, and that your doctor had specifically recommended avoiding any stress related to legal or financial discussions. My hands began trembling as the implications sank in. Victoria hadn't just excluded me from the will reading, she had constructed an elaborate fiction about my mental health to justify keeping me away from my own inheritance.
She also provided what she claimed were direct quotes from you, Marcus continued. Statements like, I can't handle thinking about money right now, and please just let the family take care of everything so I don't have to worry about it. She was very convincing, Elena, professional and concerned, exactly what you'd expect from a caring sister-in-law protecting a grieving widow. The calculated nature of Victoria's deception was breathtaking. She hadn't simply lied, she had created an entire narrative, complete with fabricated medical details and fictional quotes designed to make her story believable to legal professionals. There's more, Marcus said grimly. I contacted Harrison's physician, Dr. Samuel Rivera, to verify the medical information Victoria provided. Dr. Rivera confirmed that you were never hospitalized for any mental health issues and that your emotional state during Harrison's final weeks was remarkably stable and strong. Dr. Rivera: Harrison and I had known him for 15 years, and he'd been present for every appointment during Harrison's cancer treatment. He'd witnessed firsthand how I'd managed Harrison's care schedule, coordinated with specialists, and maintained detailed medical records. The idea that he would have recommended keeping me away from important legal matters was absurd. Dr. Rivera also shared something interesting, Marcus continued. He said Harrison had specifically mentioned to him during one of his final appointments that he was concerned about how his family might treat you after his death. Apparently, Harrison asked Dr. Rivera to check on you periodically and make sure you weren't being isolated or manipulated. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Harrison had known. He'd seen what I'd been too loyal to acknowledge, that his family had been waiting for him to die so they could finally push me out completely. Alina, there's one more thing you need to understand about the scope of this deception. Victoria didn't just lie to my office. She also provided false information to Harrison's bank, his insurance company, and his financial advisor. She told each of them that she had power of attorney to act on your behalf during your incapacitation. The room spun around me. Does she actually have power of attorney? No, Harrison never granted anyone power of attorney. Victoria has been committing fraud by claiming legal authority she doesn't possess. I walked to my kitchen window and stared out at the small garden Harrison and I had planted together last spring. The herbs were still thriving despite my recent neglect, the basil full and green, the rosemary sending up fragrant shoots. Harrison had insisted we plant rosemary because it symbolized remembrance. Mr. Thornfield, I said quietly, what happens now? That depends entirely on how you want to proceed, Elena. We could contact Victoria immediately and demand she cease all unauthorized activities. We could file criminal charges for fraud and identity theft. Or, he paused meaningfully, or what? We could allow her to continue operating under her false assumptions for a brief period while we document every fraudulent action she takes. In cases like this, it's often more effective to have overwhelming evidence of intent and pattern of behavior. Standing in my kitchen, looking at the garden that represented the only life Harrison and I had built together that Victoria couldn't steal or rewrite, I made my decision. Let's document everything, I said. I want to see exactly how far she's willing to go. What I didn't realize was that Victoria's deception was already spiraling far beyond anything I could have imagined. My phone buzzed Wednesday evening with a Facebook notification that made my blood run cold. Someone had tagged me in a photo, and when I opened the app with trembling fingers, I found myself staring at a scene that felt like a nightmare made real. There was Victoria, standing in Harrison's dining room with a crystal champagne flute raised high, surrounded by family members I barely recognized anymore. Her smile was radiant, triumphant, the expression of someone who believed she'd finally achieved everything she'd been working toward for decades. The caption read, "Celebrating new beginnings and honoring Harrison's legacy with a special family dinner in our beautiful inherited home. So grateful for this blessing. #family, #new chapter, #blessed." The dining room looked different, brighter, more formal. Victoria had already replaced Harrison's comfortable everyday china with the expensive Spode set that had belonged to his grandmother, the one we'd only used for Christmas and Easter. Fresh flowers filled crystal vases that I recognized from the formal living room, and the table was set with silver candlesticks that had been wedding gifts to Harrison's parents. I scrolled through the comments section with growing horror and fascination. The comments poured in from neighbors, family friends, even people I'd considered close to me over the years. Blake had written, "So grateful the house stays in the family where it belongs. Harrison would be proud to see his legacy in such capable hands." Cordelia's comment was more elaborate. "What a beautiful way to honor Harrison's memory. The family estate should definitely be managed by people who understand its historical significance and can preserve the Blackwood traditions for future generations." Even Jasper had added his approval. "Wonderful to see the family coming together during this transition. This is exactly what Harrison would have wanted." But it was the comments from people outside the family that stung most deeply. Grace Pemberton had written, "Congratulations on this wonderful inheritance. You've always had such elegant taste. I'm sure you'll make the house absolutely gorgeous." Mrs. Kingston from the Historical Society added, "How lovely that the Blackwood estate will remain in capable family hands. I'm sure you'll be wonderful stewards of such a historically significant property." Even Dr. Rivera have liked the post, though he hadn't left a comment. Seeing his name among the approving reactions made me feel physically sick, especially knowing that Victoria had lied to Marcus about my mental health using fabricated medical information. The photos told their own story of celebration and ownership. Victoria posing beside Harrison's favorite reading chair, now decorated with expensive throw pillows that completely destroyed its comfortable, lived-in character. Penny sprawled across the antique sofa, where Harrison and I had spent countless quiet evenings, her designer shoes kicked off carelessly onto the Persian rug. Family members I could barely identify, toasting their good fortune with wine from Harrison's carefully curated collection. In one photo, I could see Harrison's study in the background through the open French doors. Someone had already begun removing his books from the built-in shelves, the leather-bound volumes that had taken him decades to collect, now reduced to mere decorative objects to be updated or discarded. But it was the final photo that broke something inside me. Victoria had posted a close-up of herself wearing Harrison's mother's pearl necklace, the one that had been in the Blackwood family for 4 generations. Harrison had given it to me on our 10th anniversary, saying his mother would have wanted me to have it. I'd worn it to every important family occasion since then, and Victoria had always looked at it with barely concealed resentment. "Wearing great-grandmother Blackwood's pearls tonight," her caption read. "Finally back where they belong after so many years. Family heirlooms should stay in the bloodline. Hashtag family tradition, hashtag heritage." The comments on this photo were even more enthusiastic. People who had seen me wear those pearls to dozens of family gatherings now celebrated their return to the family as if I had been merely borrowing them temporarily. I sat in my small townhouse kitchen, staring at these images of people celebrating the theft of my entire life, while Victoria basked in congratulations for her fraudulent inheritance. She wasn't just stealing Harrison's estate, she was rewriting our history, making it seem like I had never really belonged, like the return of family property to bloodline members was natural and appropriate. The most chilling part was how easily everyone accepted her narrative. No one questioned where I was or why I wasn't part of this celebration. Victoria had crafted her story so skillfully that my absence felt normal, even considerate, the grieving widow stepping aside to let the real family manage important matters. But as I scrolled through photo after photo of Victoria's victory party, one thing became crystal clear. She truly believed she had won. And that confidence was about to become her greatest weakness. Thursday morning brought the first evidence that Victoria's celebration had emboldened her to take increasingly reckless actions. Iris Beaufort called me just after 9 o'clock, her voice tight with concern. "Elena, honey, I think you need to see what's happening at the house. There are trucks everywhere." I grabbed my jacket and drove over immediately, parking 2 blocks away where I could observe without being noticed. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. A massive construction dumpster dominated the circular driveway, already half filled with furniture I recognized intimately. Harrison's grandfather's handcrafted armoire sat precariously at the top, one of its ornate doors hanging by a single hinge. But it was the workers carrying out boxes of books that made me grip the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Harrison's entire collection of first edition literature, Dickens, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, was being treated like old paperbacks headed for donation. Books he'd spent 40 years collecting, reading to me on countless Sunday afternoons, were now scattered like garbage across the driveway. My phone rang, Iris again. She's hired Pemberton and Associates for a complete interior redesign, the most expensive firm in Connecticut. I heard her telling the foreman she wants everything finished within 3 weeks because she's hosting a housewarming party next month. A housewarming party. Victoria was so confident in her fraudulent ownership that she was already planning to celebrate publicly with Hartford's social elite. The audacity was breathtaking. Over the next few days, Iris became my eyes and ears, reporting developments that grew more outrageous by the hour. Victoria had scheduled private consultations with 3 different financial planning firms, telling each of them she needed to optimize her new portfolio worth nearly $4 million. She'd made appointments with luxury car dealerships, apparently planning to replace Harrison's modest Honda with something more befitting her new status. She's telling everyone who listens that she always had impeccable taste, Iris texted me Friday evening. Says Harrison never understood how to properly showcase a house of this caliber. She actually used the phrase, bringing the property up to appropriate family standards. The insult cut deep. Harrison and I had spent years carefully restoring that house, researching period-appropriate fixtures, learning about architectural preservation. Every detail had been chosen with love and respect for the home's history. Now Victoria was treating our careful work like amateur decoration that needed professional correction. But it was Saturday's development that revealed the true scope of Victoria's reckless confidence. She had contacted Sophie Brennan from Brennan Realty about listing the house for sale. Market evaluation appointment scheduled for Monday morning, Iris reported. I saw Sophie measuring the front garden. Victoria told her she wants to move quickly because the spring market is optimal for luxury properties. The woman was planning to sell Harrison's family estate, my inheritance, before she even legally owned it. The criminal overreach was staggering, but also perfect evidence for Marcus Thornfield's documentation file. Sunday brought perhaps the most revealing insight into Victoria's mindset. Penny had posted Instagram stories from a luxury spa weekend in the Berkshires, tagged with #newlife and #blessed. The caption read, "Celebrating Mom's incredible inheritance with some much-needed relaxation. So grateful for family blessings and new opportunities." But it was Victoria's own social media activity that showed just how completely she'd convinced herself of her victory. She'd changed her Facebook profile to Victoria Blackwood, Estate Manager and Family Legacy Coordinator. Her bio now read, "Dedicated to preserving generational wealth and maintaining family traditions, blessed to carry forward the Blackwood heritage." Estate Manager? She'd literally given herself a title based on property she'd stolen through fraud. The final piece of evidence came Sunday evening when Theodore Walsh from First National Bank called me directly, something that had never happened in 31 years of banking there. "Mrs. Blackwood, I apologize for calling on the weekend, but there's been some confusion about your account access. Someone claiming to represent you has been asking about transferring significant assets, and I wanted to verify these instructions directly with you." My blood ran cold. What kind of instructions? A Mrs. Victoria Blackwood contacted us yesterday, claiming she had power of attorney to manage your finances during what she described as your temporary incapacitation due to severe grief. She wanted to transfer the contents of your joint accounts with Harrison into a new estate management account under her control. Victoria wasn't just spending money she didn't have on renovations and luxury purchases. She was actively attempting to steal my actual bank accounts by claiming I was mentally incompetent to manage my own finances. "Mr. Walsh," I said carefully, "I never granted anyone power of attorney, and I'm certainly not incapacitated in any way." "I suspected as much," he replied. "That's why I'm calling you directly." Mrs. Blackwood became quite insistent when I told her we'd need to verify any such arrangements with you personally. She suggested that contacting you directly might be emotionally harmful to your recovery process. After hanging up, I called Marcus Thornfield immediately. His reaction was swift and decisive. Elena, this has escalated beyond simple inheritance fraud. Victoria is now attempting identity theft and financial exploitation. We need to act soon before her criminal behavior causes irreparable damage to your assets and reputation. But I wasn't ready to stop the documentation yet. Victoria's overconfidence was revealing the true scope of her deception, and I wanted to see exactly how far she was willing to go before her house of lies came crashing down. Monday morning marked the beginning of what Marcus Thornfield would later call the most thorough documentation of estate fraud he'd ever compiled. With Iris Buford serving as my unofficial surveillance coordinator, we began systematically recording every aspect of Victoria's increasingly brazen criminal activity. The first breakthrough came when Iris managed to photograph Victoria's meeting with Sophie Brennan from the realty company. Through her telephoto lens, she captured images of Victoria signing what appeared to be listing agreements while gesturing confidently around the property as if she'd owned it for years. She told Sophie the house has been in her family for 3 generations, Iris texted me later, said she was reluctantly selling because maintaining such a large estate was becoming too much responsibility for her to handle alone. The irony was staggering. Victoria was presenting herself as the overwhelmed inheritor of a family burden, when in reality, she was a criminal attempting to sell stolen property. Marcus had connected me with Detective Angela Foster from the Hartford Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, who was fascinated by the scope of Victoria's deception. Detective Foster helped me understand how to document each fraudulent action in ways that would hold up in court. What makes this case unusual, Detective Foster explained during our Tuesday meeting, is how systematic and public Victoria's fraud has become. Most financial criminals try to stay hidden. Victoria is broadcasting her crimes on social media and involving multiple legitimate businesses in her schemes. She was right. Victoria's confidence had made her careless about leaving evidence trails. Every contractor consultation, every financial planning meeting, every social media post created documentation of her fraudulent claims. The most damaging evidence came Wednesday when Frank Delacroix, the contractor Victoria had hired for the renovation, called me directly. He'd somehow obtained my phone number and seemed genuinely confused about the property ownership situation. "Mrs. Blackwood, I apologize for bothering you, but there's been some confusion about payment authorization for the work at 124-7 Riverside Drive. Mrs. Victoria Blackwood hired us 3 weeks ago for a complete interior renovation, but yesterday our invoice was declined by her bank." My pulse quickened. What kind of renovation work? Extensive kitchen and living room redesign, about $38,000 in labor and materials. When we called about the payment issue, Mrs. Victoria became quite agitated and suggested we contact you about alternative payment arrangements. The audacity took my breath away. Victoria had commissioned nearly $40,000 in renovation work on property she didn't own, using money she didn't have, and when her fraud was exposed by insufficient funds, she'd tried to make me responsible for the bills? "Mr. Delacroix," I said carefully, "I haven't authorized any renovations, and I'm not responsible for Mrs. Victoria Blackwood's financial commitments." His silence stretched uncomfortably. "Mrs. Blackwood, are you saying you're not aware that extensive construction work is currently underway at your property?" "That's exactly what I'm saying." After documenting this conversation with Detective Foster, I learned that Victoria had provided Frank's company with forged authorization documents claiming she had legal power of attorney to approve renovations on my behalf. The forgery charges alone could result in serious criminal penalties. Thursday brought even more evidence when Theodore Walsh called with an update about Victoria's banking fraud attempts. She's contacted us 3 more times this week, each time becoming more insistent about her supposed authority to manage your accounts. Yesterday, she actually threatened to report us to banking regulators for obstructing legitimate estate management activities. Victoria's desperation was beginning to show through her confidence facade. When legitimate institutions refused to accept her fraudulent claims, she was becoming hostile and making increasingly unrealistic threats. The most revealing evidence came Friday when Dr. Rivera called me directly. Elena, I received the strangest call yesterday from someone claiming to be coordinating your medical care during what she called your extended psychiatric treatment. She was asking for detailed information about your mental health status and requesting documentation to support ongoing guardianship proceedings. My blood ran cold. Victoria is trying to have me declared mentally incompetent? Apparently so. She told my office she was petitioning the court for emergency guardianship to protect you from making poor financial decisions during your severe psychological crisis. She wanted me to provide medical testimony supporting her petition. Victoria wasn't just stealing my inheritance. She was attempting to have me declared legally incompetent so she could control my entire life. The criminal conspiracy was expanding beyond simple fraud into something far more sinister. As I compiled all this evidence with Marcus and Detective Foster, one thing became crystal clear. Victoria had crossed so many legal boundaries that when her deception finally unraveled, the consequences would be catastrophic. The only question remaining was how much further she would go before reality caught up with her elaborate house of lies. The breaking point came on Monday morning when Iris called me in tears. Elena, I can't just text you about this. You need to get over here right now. I found her standing in her driveway, phone in hand, staring at the scene unfolding across the street. Victoria had hired a team of workers to clear out what she called outdated furnishings and personal clutter from the mansion. But what I witnessed wasn't careful estate management. It was the systematic destruction of 31 years of memories. Harrison's beloved leather reading chair, the one where he'd spent countless evenings with his newspapers and classical music, was being carried out in pieces. The movers had apparently tried to force it through a doorway that was too narrow, breaking off one of the arms and splitting the seat cushion. I watched in horror as they tossed the broken pieces onto a growing pile of discarded furniture. She told them everything in the study was worthless old junk, Iris whispered, gripping my arm. They've been throwing away books and papers all morning. Through the mansion's windows, I could see strangers dismantling Harrison's private sanctuary. His collection of vintage fountain pens, including the Mont Blanc I'd given him for our 20th anniversary, was being swept into cardboard boxes like common office supplies. The antique desk where he'd written letters and managed his investments was already gone, probably sold to an antique dealer or thrown away as outdated furniture. But it was the next scene that made me double over with grief and rage. 2 workers emerged from the house carrying Harrison's prized possession, a hand-carved mahogany bookshelf that had belonged to his grandfather. The craftsmanship was exquisite, irreplaceable, and Harrison had spent hours telling me stories about watching his grandfather work on it in the 1940s. They dropped it. The impact shattered one entire side, sending splinters of century-old mahogany across the driveway. When one worker suggested they might be able to repair it, his supervisor shrugged. Lady said she wants everything gone by tonight. Just toss it with the rest. I had to turn away as they threw Harrison's grandfather's bookshelf into the dumpster like construction debris. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Elena, this is Penny Sterling. Mom wanted me to reach out about some personal items we found while clearing out the house. There are some old photo albums and jewelry boxes that don't really fit with the new decor, but Mom thought you might want them for sentimental reasons. The calculated cruelty took my breath away. Victoria was offering to give me my own possessions and memories as if she were being generous by not throwing them away with everything else. I typed back immediately. Yes, I'd very much like to collect anything that belonged to Harrison and me. The response came within minutes. Actually, Mom thinks it might be easier if we just boxed everything up and had it delivered to you. She's concerned that coming to the house during the renovation might be too emotionally overwhelming. We'll make sure you get anything that has real personal value. Victoria was deciding which of my own memories had real personal value and which could be discarded. The woman was literally erasing my existence from the house while presenting herself as considerate and protective. Tuesday brought an even more devastating blow. Grace Pemberton called me directly, her voice strained with embarrassment. Elena, I need to apologize for something terrible. Victoria came to my shop yesterday asking about selling some items she claimed were family heirlooms that had been stored inappropriately in the house. My heart stopped. What kind of items? Your wedding china set, some silver serving pieces, and that beautiful pearl necklace you always wore to church functions. She said they needed proper appraisal and care, that they'd been damaged by improper storage. Victoria was selling my personal belongings and presenting it as estate management. She'd taken Harrison's mother's pearls, the ones she'd worn so triumphantly in her social media photos, and was now trying to profit from them by claiming they'd been neglected under my care. Grace, I said carefully, those aren't family heirlooms that were stored improperly. That's my wedding china and my pearl necklace. Victoria has no right to sell any of it. The silence on Grace's end stretched uncomfortably long. Oh my God, Elena, I had no idea. Victoria was so convincing about the family estate management situation. She showed me documents that looked official. Victoria had forged additional paperwork to support her theft of my personal belongings. The criminal activity was expanding exponentially, but so was the evidence trail she was creating with each fraudulent action. That evening, as I sat surrounded by the few possessions I still owned, I realized Victoria wasn't just stealing my inheritance. She was systematically destroying every trace of the life Harrison and I had built together, rewriting our history so completely that it would be as if our marriage had never happened. The time for documentation was ending. Soon, it would be time for justice. The first crack in Victoria's facade appeared Wednesday morning when my phone rang with a call from Marcus Chen at Elite Interior Design. His voice carried the strained professionalism of someone dealing with a very uncomfortable situation. Mrs. Blackwood, I apologize for calling directly, but there's been significant confusion about payment authorization for the renovation project at 124-7 Riverside Drive. I gripped the phone tighter. What kind of confusion, Mr. Chen? Mrs. Victoria Blackwood hired our firm 3 weeks ago for a complete kitchen and living room redesign. The initial payment of $15,000 cleared without issue, but yesterday her bank declined our second invoice for $23,000. When we contacted her about alternative payment methods, she became quite agitated and insisted we reach out to you directly. The implications hit me immediately. Victoria had been spending money she didn't actually have, probably maxing out credit cards or depleting her savings account based on her fraudulent expectations of inheriting Harrison's estate. Mr. Chen, I need to be very clear about something. I haven't authorized any renovations to that property, and I'm not responsible for any financial commitments Mrs. Victoria Blackwood has made. His uncomfortable silence stretched for several seconds. Mrs. Blackwood, are you saying you weren't aware that extensive construction work is currently underway at your property? That's exactly what I'm saying. After hanging up, I immediately called Marcus Thornfield with this development. His reaction was swift and decisive. This is perfect evidence of unauthorized financial decisions based on fraudulent ownership claims. Victoria's spending has apparently exceeded whatever personal resources she had access to. Thursday brought a cascade of similar calls. Frank Delacroix from the construction company called about unpaid invoices totaling $38,000. Sophie Brennan from the realty office wanted clarification about listing authorization after Victoria's checks for marketing fees had bounced. Even the expensive catering company Victoria had hired for her planned housewarming party was demanding payment guarantees. But it was Detective Foster's call Thursday afternoon that revealed the true scope of Victoria's financial crisis. Elena, we've been monitoring Victoria's banking activity as part of our fraud investigation. She's attempted to withdraw cash advances on 4 different credit cards this week, all of which were denied due to insufficient credit limits. Victoria's house of cards was collapsing under the weight of her own greed and overconfidence. Friday morning brought the most dramatic evidence yet when Iris called me in a state of barely controlled excitement. Elena, you have to see what's happening over here. There are 3 different trucks in the driveway, and none of them look friendly. I drove over to find chaos unfolding at the mansion. Elite Interior Design had sent a crew to remove all the materials and fixtures they'd installed since Victoria couldn't pay for them. Frank Delacroix's construction team was demanding immediate payment or they'd file liens against the property. Most telling of all, a locksmith was changing the locks on the front door while Victoria stood on the porch arguing frantically into her phone. Through Iris's telephoto lens, we captured images of Victoria's complete meltdown. Her perfectly composed facade had cracked entirely, revealing a woman in desperate financial straits who had gambled everything on an inheritance that didn't exist. "She's been on the phone for 2 hours," Iris reported. "I heard her screaming at someone about family obligations and legal technicalities. She kept saying something about how Elena should be responsible for covering the renovation costs since it was Elena's house." The irony was breathtaking. Victoria had spent weeks claiming I was mentally incompetent to handle financial matters, but now that her fraud was collapsing, she wanted me to pay the bills for improvements I'd never authorized on property she'd stolen. Marcus Thornfield's afternoon call confirmed what we were witnessing. Victoria contacted my office 3 times today, demanding immediate access to estate funds to cover what she called property maintenance expenses. When I explained that she had no legal authority to access any estate assets, she threatened to file complaints against me with the Connecticut Bar Association. Victoria's desperation was making her increasingly reckless. Instead of retreating when her crimes were exposed, she was doubling down with more threats and more fraudulent claims. But the most revealing call came Friday evening from Theodore Walsh at the bank. "Mrs. Blackwood, I wanted to inform you that Victoria made a very disturbing scene at our branch today. She demanded to speak with the bank president about what she called our obstruction of legitimate estate management activities. Security had to escort her from the building when she refused to leave." Victoria's careful facade of respectability was disintegrating completely. The woman who had presented herself as a sophisticated estate manager was now being removed from banks by security guards. The financial reality was closing in on her from every direction, and her next moves would determine whether this ended with quiet legal resolution or spectacular public humiliation. Monday morning brought news that Victoria's desperation had driven her to even more reckless financial decisions. Patricia Holmes, Victoria's own neighbor, called me with information that made my blood run cold. "Elena, I hope you don't mind me reaching out, but I felt someone should tell you what's been happening at Victoria's house. There was quite a scene over the weekend." I settled into Harrison's reading chair, bracing myself. What kind of scene? Saturday morning, I saw Victoria loading jewelry boxes and silver pieces into her car. When I asked if she was going somewhere special, she got very flustered and said she was liquidating some assets for investment diversification purposes. But Elena, I recognized some of those items. They were pieces I'd seen you wearing at church and family gatherings over the years. My hands began trembling. Victoria was pawning my personal belongings to pay for the renovations she couldn't afford. The desperation was making her steal from me directly, not just through fraudulent inheritance claims. "There's more," Patricia continued reluctantly. "Sunday afternoon, a man in an expensive suit came to her door demanding to speak about property authorization documents. The conversation got quite heated, and he left looking very frustrated. Victoria spent the rest of the day making phone calls, and I could hear her shouting from my garden." Tuesday brought confirmation of Victoria's increasingly desperate financial situation when Grace Pemberton called me directly. "Elena, I need to tell you something disturbing. Victoria came to my antique shop yesterday trying to sell items she claimed were family heirlooms that needed immediate liquidation for tax purposes." "What kind of items?" "Your wedding silver, some crystal pieces I remembered from your house, and that beautiful mahogany jewelry box Harrison gave you for Christmas 2 years ago. The one with your initials engraved on the lid." Grace's voice carried obvious distress. "Elena, she was asking for cash transactions only, no paperwork, no receipts. She said the family needed to handle the sales discreetly for estate planning reasons. Victoria was trying to sell my possessions through underground cash transactions to avoid creating evidence trails. The woman who had spent weeks positioning herself as a sophisticated estate manager was now operating like a common thief trying to fence stolen goods." Wednesday's developments revealed the full scope of Victoria's financial crisis. Theodore Walsh called with an update that made the situation clear. Elena, Victoria attempted to open 3 different personal loans this week, using various properties as collateral, including the Riverside Drive mansion. When the loan officers requested proof of ownership, she provided what appeared to be forged property deeds, with her name substituted for yours. Can she actually get loans using forged documents? Not from legitimate institutions, but Elena, the concerning part is that she's also approached several private lenders, the kind who don't ask too many questions about documentation. Detective Foster should know about this immediately. Victoria's desperation was driving her toward increasingly dangerous territory. Private lenders with questionable practices could put her in genuine physical danger, but they could also create legal complications that might affect my actual property ownership. Thursday brought the most alarming development yet when Dr. Rivera called with urgent news. Elena, Victoria contacted my office again yesterday with a very disturbing request. She wanted me to provide written documentation supporting an emergency psychiatric commitment for you. My blood turned to ice. She wants to have me institutionalized? She claimed you'd been making threats against family members and showing signs of severe mental instability. She wanted me to sign papers supporting an involuntary 72-hour psychiatric hold so she could obtain emergency guardianship over your assets. The criminal conspiracy was escalating beyond financial fraud into something approaching kidnapping. Victoria was so desperate to maintain control over the stolen inheritance that she was willing to have me falsely imprisoned in a psychiatric facility. Dr. Rivera, you told her no, didn't you? Of course I refused, but Elena, she became very aggressive when I declined. She threatened to report me to medical licensing authorities for failing to protect a mentally ill patient. She also mentioned that she had other medical professionals who would provide the necessary documentation. Victoria was attempting to find doctors who would falsify psychiatric evaluations to support her guardianship petition. The woman was so deep into criminal territory that she was willing to corrupt medical professionals and abuse the mental health system to cover up her fraud. Friday evening brought a call from Detective Foster that confirmed our worst fears. Elena, we've been monitoring Victoria's communications, and she's definitely planning something desperate. She scheduled meetings with 2 different lawyers about emergency guardianship proceedings, and she's contacted a private investigation firm about documenting your erratic behavior. The walls were closing in on Victoria from every financial and legal direction, and her response was to escalate the criminal activity rather than face the consequences of her actions. She was preparing for a final, desperate gamble that could destroy both of our lives completely. But Victoria had made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated exactly how much evidence we'd been gathering about her fraudulent activities and how ready we were to use it. The pressure Victoria was facing began to fracture the family coalition that had initially supported her fraudulent claims. The first crack appeared Tuesday morning when Blake called me directly, something that hadn't happened since Harrison's funeral 3 months earlier. Elena, we need to talk. His voice carried a strain I'd never heard before. There are some things happening with Victoria's handling of the estate that are making me very uncomfortable. I settled into my kitchen chair, surprised by this unexpected contact. What kind of things, Blake? She's been asking me to co-sign loan applications using the Riverside Drive property as collateral. When I asked to see the ownership documentation, she got defensive and said I was questioning her authority during a family crisis. He paused, and I could hear traffic in the background. Elena, I may not be the smartest guy in the family, but I know enough about real estate to recognize that something's not right here. The revelation that Victoria was trying to involve other family members in her fraud showed how desperate her situation had become, but more importantly, it was causing them to ask questions they'd never bothered to ask before. Blake, I said carefully, have you actually seen Harrison's will? Another long pause. Victoria said it was too complicated for non-lawyers to understand, that Marcus Thornfield would explain everything to us after the initial legal requirements were handled. But Elena, it's been 3 months, and every time I ask for specific details, she changes the subject. Wednesday brought an even more significant development when Cordelia called, her voice tight with anxiety. Elena, I need to apologize for something, and I need to ask you some very direct questions about what's been happening since Harrison's death. What's wrong, Cordelia? Victoria approached me yesterday asking for a $50,000 loan to cover what she called temporary estate management expenses. She said the inheritance funds were tied up in probate complications, but that she needed immediate cash to maintain the property and handle ongoing obligations. I gripped the phone tighter. Victoria was now trying to borrow money from family members to cover the bills for renovations she couldn't afford on property she'd stolen through fraud. When I asked to see some documentation about these expenses, Cordelia continued, she became very agitated and said I was being disloyal to the family during a crisis. But Elena, I've been thinking about how strange it's been that you haven't been involved in any of the estate discussions. In 31 years, I've never known you to avoid family responsibilities, especially something as important as Harrison's final wishes. The family members who had initially accepted Victoria's narrative about my voluntary exclusion were finally beginning to question the logic of that story. Thursday's phone call from Jasper confirmed that Victoria's support system was collapsing entirely. Elena, my dear, I owe you a tremendous apology. I've been thinking about the will reading situation, and I realize I never actually heard from you directly about your decision not to participate. That's right, Jasper. I was told I wasn't welcome because I wasn't blood family. His sharp intake of breath was audible. That's not what Victoria told us at all. She said you had specifically asked the family to handle everything because you were too overwhelmed by grief to participate in legal proceedings. The discrepancies in Victoria's stories to different family members were finally becoming obvious. She'd told me one version of events while giving everyone else a completely different explanation for my absence. There's something else troubling me, Jasper continued. Victoria has been asking each of us for loans or financial commitments related to estate management, but she's been very secretive about providing any actual documentation. When I requested to see Harrison's mill directly, she said Marcus Thornfield had advised against showing it to family members until all legal requirements were completed. Friday brought the most damaging revelation when Blake called again, this time with information that could destroy Victoria's credibility entirely. Elena, I did something I probably should have done months ago. I called Marcus Thornfield directly to ask about the probate timeline and when we might expect to see distributions from Harrison's estate. My heart began racing. What did he tell you? He told me that there aren't any distributions planned for family members because Harrison left everything to you as his spouse. Elena, Marcus said you're the sole beneficiary of the entire estate and that Victoria has been operating under completely false assumptions about inheritance rights. The house of cards was finally collapsing. Victoria's own family members were discovering that she'd been lying to them for months about fundamental aspects of Harrison's will and estate planning. Marcus also told me something else that makes me sick to my stomach, Blake continued. Victoria has been claiming to have power of attorney to act on your behalf during your supposed mental health crisis. Elena, did you ever grant her power of attorney for anything? Absolutely not. Blake, Victoria has been committing fraud for months, and she's been involving all of you in her criminal activities without your knowledge. By Friday evening, the family coalition that had initially supported Victoria's claims had completely dissolved. Each family member was realizing they'd been manipulated and lied to, and their anger was turning toward the person who had deceived them all. Victoria was about to discover that when your criminal conspiracy depends on family loyalty, betraying that family's trust is the most dangerous mistake you can make. The confrontation came on Monday morning when Victoria called me directly, and for the first time since Harrison's funeral, her carefully controlled facade was completely gone. Her voice shook with barely contained rage and desperation. Elena, we need to talk immediately. This whole situation has gotten completely out of hand because of your selfish behavior. I settled into Harrison's reading chair, recognizing that this was the moment Victoria's true nature would finally be revealed. What situation, Victoria? You know exactly what situation. These contractors are calling me constantly, demanding payment for work that benefits you. The real estate agents won't return my calls, and now my own family members are questioning my authority over estate matters. Her voice was rising with each sentence, the polished socialite persona dissolving into something much uglier. Victoria, maybe you should have thought about those consequences before you started spending money that wasn't yours on property you don't own. It should have been mine. The scream that erupted from her throat was barely human. I'm his sister. I've been part of this family since birth, not some outsider who married her way into money she never deserved. There it was. After months of careful manipulation and false concern, Victoria's true feelings were finally exploding into the open. The mask she'd worn for decades had completely shattered. 23 years of resentment, she continued, her voice now a venomous whisper. Watching you play the devoted wife while contributing nothing to this family except your presence at dinner parties. You had no family connections, no inherited wealth, no social standing, nothing to offer except your willingness to make Harrison forget about his real family obligations. I remained silent, letting her destroy herself with her own words while mentally recording every admission for Marcus Thornfield and Detective Foster. We're blood family, Elena. We built the Blackwood name over generations, while you just showed up and expected to benefit from our heritage. You don't deserve any of this, not the house, not the investments, not the social standing that comes with the Blackwood legacy. Her breathing was becoming ragged, desperate. I've spent 31 years watching you take what should have belonged to Harrison's real family, watching you convince him to choose you over us, to prioritize your little suburban life over his responsibilities to the bloodline. The depth of her delusion was staggering. Victoria had convinced herself that my marriage to Harrison was somehow a theft from his real family, as if love and commitment were resources that had been taken away from her. Harrison saw through you eventually, she continued, her voice carrying a cruel satisfaction. Why do you think he kept you out of important family business decisions? Why do you think he never gave you real authority over the estate planning? He knew you weren't equipped to handle serious family responsibilities. The irony was overwhelming. Victoria was describing her own exclusion tactics as evidence of Harrison's judgment, when in reality, Harrison had protected me from his family's hostility while secretly ensuring I would inherit everything. But I won, Elena. I finally won. I have the house, I have the authority, I have the respect of the community. Everyone sees me as the legitimate heir to the Blackwood estate, while you sit alone in your little townhouse where you belong. Her victory declaration was so detached from reality that it revealed the complete extent of her psychological breakdown. Victoria genuinely believed her fraud had succeeded, even as evidence of her criminal activities mounted around her. Victoria, I said quietly, you don't have any of those things. You've stolen property that doesn't belong to you, committed multiple felonies, and destroyed your reputation with everyone who matters. The only thing you've won is a criminal record. The silence that followed was deafening. When Victoria finally spoke again, her voice had dropped to something cold and dangerous. You can't prove any of that. Everyone believes I'm the rightful heir managing a family crisis. Your word against mine, Elena, and I've been building my credibility for months while you've been hiding away like the broken widow everyone expects you to be. Her confidence was terrifying because it revealed how completely she disconnected from reality. Victoria truly believed that her public relations campaign had created legal rights, that social media posts and dinner parties could override actual legal documents. We'll see about that, Victoria, I said, ending the call. The mask had finally dropped completely, revealing the depth of her delusion and the extent of her criminal intent.
But Victoria had made one final miscalculation. She assumed I'd been hiding away in weakness, when in fact I'd been gathering evidence that would destroy her elaborate house of lies completely. The time for documentation was over. Tomorrow, it would be time for justice.
Tuesday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of autumn, and I woke with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since before Harrison's death. At exactly 9 o'clock, Marcus Thornfield, Detective Foster, and I stood on the front steps of the Riverside Drive mansion, armed with legal documents that would change everything. Marcus carried his leather briefcase containing the certified copies of Harrison's will, the documented evidence of Victoria's fraud, and the emergency court orders we'd obtained the previous afternoon. Detective Foster wore her badge prominently, a reminder that this was now a criminal matter as well as a civil one. Behind us, a sheriff's deputy waited in his patrol car, a precaution Marcus had insisted upon after Victoria's increasingly erratic behavior over the past week. The front door opened before we could knock. Victoria appeared wearing one of her expensive silk blouses and that practiced smile she'd perfected over decades of social manipulation. But there was something different in her eyes now, a manic brightness that suggested her grip on reality was becoming increasingly tenuous. "Well, well, look who finally decided to visit." Her voice carried forced cheerfulness that didn't match the tension radiating from her body. "Elena, dear, I hope you've come to apologize for all the trouble you've been causing with these legal misunderstandings." Marcus stepped forward, his professional demeanor commanding immediate attention. "Mrs. Victoria Blackwood, I'm here in my capacity as executor of Harrison Blackwood's estate to deliver these legal documents and inform you that you must vacate these premises immediately." Her confident smile flickered momentarily as she glanced at the official papers in his hands. "I don't know what game you people think you're playing, but this is my family's property now. Elena has no legitimate claim here." Detective Foster moved closer, her hand resting casually near her badge. "Ma'am, we need to discuss several criminal matters related to fraud, identity theft, and forgery. I strongly suggest you accept these documents and cooperate with the legal process." Victoria's facade began cracking as the reality of the situation penetrated her delusional confidence. "This is harassment. I'm the legitimate heir managing a family estate during a crisis. Elena has been mentally unstable since Harrison's death, and everyone knows it." "Mrs. Morrison," Marcus said formally, "you are not the heir to anything. Elena Blackwood is the sole beneficiary of Harrison's entire estate, as clearly specified in his legally binding will." He handed her the first document, a certified copy of Harrison's will with Elena's name highlighted as the primary beneficiary. I watched her face as she read it once, twice, then a third time, the color draining from her cheeks like water from a broken dam. "This can't be right," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "There's been some mistake. I'm his sister. I'm his blood family." "There's no mistake, Victoria," I said quietly, speaking for the first time since arriving. "Harrison left everything to me because I was his wife and the person he chose to trust with his legacy." The words seemed to trigger something in Victoria that transformed her shock into pure rage. The mask she'd worn for so many years shattered completely. "This is theft," she screamed, her voice echoing across the neighborhood. "You've stolen everything that rightfully belongs to his real family. You're nothing but a manipulative gold digger who wormed her way into our lives." Neighbors began appearing on their porches, drawn by the commotion. I could see Iris Buford standing in her driveway with her phone, probably recording the scene that would soon become evidence in criminal proceedings. Detective Foster stepped forward as Victoria's voice grew more hysterical. "Ma'am, I need you to lower your voice and accept these legal documents. Your behavior is creating a public disturbance." But Victoria was beyond rational thought now. She snatched the eviction notice from Marcus's hand and tore it in half, the pieces fluttering to the ground like confetti. "You can't make me leave my own family's house. I've put thousands of dollars into renovating this place. I've made it beautiful again after years of Elena's suburban mediocrity." Mrs. Morrison, Marcus said professionally, you have 72 hours to vacate the premises. Any personal property you've brought to the house may be removed, but everything that belonged to Harrison or was purchased with estate funds remains here. Victoria's face contorted with desperate fury. I'll fight this. I'll contest the will. I'll prove that Elena manipulated Harrison against his own family. This isn't over. Detective Foster produced a second set of documents from her folder. Actually, Mrs. Morrison, we also have warrants for your arrest on charges of fraud, identity theft, forgery, and attempted theft of over $4 million in estate assets. The blood drained completely from Victoria's face as the full reality of her situation finally became clear. Her criminal conspiracy hadn't just failed, it had created a mountain of evidence that would likely result in significant prison time. As Detective Foster began reading Victoria her rights, I looked up at the house that had been my second home for 31 years, finally knowing that justice had been served and Harrison's final wishes would be honored. The neighborhood watched in stunned silence as Detective Foster led Victoria toward the patrol car, her hands cuffed behind her back. The woman who had spent months positioning herself as the sophisticated heir to the Blackwood estate was now being arrested for fraud in full view of the community she'd tried so hard to impress. Iris Buford wasn't the only neighbor recording the scene. Within minutes, phones appeared on multiple porches as residents documented Victoria's spectacular downfall. The same people who had congratulated her on social media about her inheritance were now witnessing the criminal reality behind her celebration posts. "This is a mistake," Victoria screamed as Detective Foster guided her toward the car. "I'm the victim here. Elena has manipulated everyone against me. She's stolen my family's estate through legal technicalities." But her protests only made the situation worse. Every word she screamed was being recorded by neighbors who had watched her behavior over the past 3 months with growing suspicion. Her claims of victimhood rang hollow to people who had seen her throwing away Harrison's possessions and bragging about her expensive renovations. Blake and Cordelia arrived just as Victoria was being placed in the police car. I watched their faces transform from confusion to horror as they realized the full scope of what their family member had done. The loan she'd requested, the authority she'd claimed, the legal documents she'd referenced, all of it had been part of an elaborate criminal fraud. "Elena," Blake said quietly as we watched the patrol car disappear down Riverside Drive, "I owe you an enormous apology. We all do." Cordelia was crying openly. How did we not see this? How did we believe her lies for so long? The answer was complicated. Victoria had exploited their existing prejudices about my place in the family, their assumptions about inheritance rights, and their willingness to explanations that confirmed what they'd always secretly believed, that I was an outsider who didn't really belong. By noon, the story was spreading through Hartford's social circles like wildfire. The contractors Victoria had hired were telling everyone about her bounced checks and fraudulent authorization documents. The real estate agents were sharing stories about her attempts to list property she didn't own. The bank employees were discussing her increasingly erratic behavior and threats against institutional policies. Grace Pemberton called me that afternoon with news about the community's reaction. "Elena, I've had 12 different people stop by the shop today asking about Victoria's arrest. Everyone's talking about how she tried to sell your personal belongings and claimed they were family heirlooms." The most damaging revelation came when the Hartford Courant picked up the story. "Local woman arrested for $4 million estate fraud" ran as the front page headline Wednesday morning, complete with details about Victoria's systematic deception and criminal activities. The article included quotes from the contractors she'd stiffed, the banks she'd threatened, and the medical professionals she tried to corrupt. Every aspect of her carefully constructed fraud was exposed in excruciating detail. But perhaps the most devastating consequence was the complete collapse of her social standing. The dinner parties stopped, the country club memberships were quietly revoked, the charitable organizations removed her from their boards. Within 48 hours, Victoria Blackwood had transformed from a respected member of Hartford society into a cautionary tale about greed, delusion, and criminal behavior. The woman who had spent 31 years making me feel like an outsider was now completely alone, facing federal fraud charges while I reclaimed the life and home that had always been mine. 3 weeks after Victoria's arrest, I stood in the doorway of Harrison's study, now truly mine again, holding the phone as Marcus Thornfield explained my options for the property. The house felt different now, not haunted by memories of exclusion, but filled with potential for something meaningful. The insurance will cover most of the damage from Victoria's unauthorized renovations, Marcus was saying. But Elena, you have complete freedom to decide what to do with the estate. You could restore it to exactly how you and Harrison had it, sell it, or transform it into something entirely new. I looked around the study where Victoria had tried to erase Harrison's presence, where she'd thrown away his books and scattered his memories like garbage. The room had been stripped bare, but somehow that emptiness felt like possibility rather than loss. Marcus, I said quietly, I've been thinking about something Harrison said during his final weeks. He talked about how lucky we'd been to build a life together, and how he wished we could help other people find that same kind of security and love. What did you have in mind? I want to convert the mansion into a transitional housing facility for women who are rebuilding their lives after difficult divorces or family situations, women who've been excluded, overlooked, or told they don't deserve better. The silence on Marcus's end stretched for several seconds. Elena, that's a remarkable way to honor Harrison's memory. And given what you've been through with Victoria, it seems especially meaningful. The idea had been growing in my mind since the day of Victoria's arrest. All those months of being made to feel like I didn't belong, of being told I wasn't real family, of watching my life and memories be systematically erased. I didn't want any other woman to experience that kind of isolation and dismissal. I want to call it the Harrison Blackwood House for New Beginnings, I continued. A place where women can stay while they're getting back on their feet, where they can remember their own strength and worth. The local newspaper picked up the story by Thursday. Fraud victim transforms stolen estate into women's shelter became a feel-good follow-up to the scandal that had captivated Hartford society. But this time, the focus was on healing rather than crime, on generosity rather than greed. The response from the community was overwhelming. Blake called to offer volunteer construction services to help with the conversion. Cordelia wanted to organize donation drives and coordinate with local women's organizations. Even Jasper, despite his advanced age, insisted on contributing to the funding for the project. Elena, Blake said during our first planning meeting, this is exactly what Harrison would have wanted. He always believed in helping people who needed a second chance. Dr. Rivera volunteered to provide medical services for residents. Grace Pemberton offered to coordinate with local businesses for job placement programs. Even some of Victoria's former social circle reached out, apparently eager to distance themselves from her criminal behavior by supporting my charitable project. The most unexpected support came from Iris Buford, who had documented so much of Victoria's fraud. Elena, I've watched you handle this entire situation with such grace and strength. These women you're planning to help are lucky to have someone who truly understands what it feels like to be excluded and underestimated. As I walked through the mansion that afternoon, imagining it filled with women rebuilding their lives rather than echoing with Victoria's bitter resentment, I felt Harrison's presence in a way I hadn't since his funeral. This wasn't just about transforming a house. It was about transforming pain into purpose, exclusion into inclusion, and theft into generosity. The home that Victoria had tried to steal would become a sanctuary for women who, like me, had been told they didn't belong but refused to accept that verdict as final. 6 months later, I stood in the grand foyer of the Harrison Blackwood House for New Beginnings as our first group of residents moved in. The mansion had been transformed, but not in the gaudy, expensive way Victoria had planned. Instead, the renovations focused on warmth and functionality, comfortable common areas where women could share meals and stories, private bedrooms that offered dignity and security, and a library where Harrison's restored book collection created a quiet space for reflection and healing. The opening ceremony was small but meaningful. Blake had worked alongside professional contractors to restore the damage Victoria's renovations had caused, his hands-on involvement serving as both apology and redemption for his initial support of her fraud. Cordelia coordinated with 3 different women's organizations to identify the first residents, while Jasper's financial contributions ensured the facility could operate without charging rent to women who were already struggling financially. The most unexpected support came from Iris Buford, who had documented so much of Victoria's fraud. "Elena, I've watched you handle this entire situation with such grace and strength. These women you're planning to help are lucky to have someone who truly understands what it feels like to be excluded and underestimated." As I walked through the mansion that afternoon, imagining it filled with women rebuilding their lives rather than echoing with Victoria's bitter resentment, I felt Harrison's presence in a way I hadn't since his funeral. This wasn't just about transforming a house. It was about transforming pain into purpose, exclusion into inclusion, and theft into generosity. The home that Victoria had tried to steal would become a sanctuary for women who, like me, had been told they didn't belong but refused to accept that verdict as final. 6 months later, I stood in the grand foyer of the Harrison Blackwood House for New Beginnings as our first group of residents moved in. The mansion had been transformed, but not in the gaudy, expensive way Victoria had planned. Instead, the renovations focused on warmth and functionality, comfortable common areas where women could share meals and stories, private bedrooms that offered dignity and security, and a library where Harrison's restored book collection created a quiet space for reflection and healing. The opening ceremony was small but meaningful. Blake had worked alongside professional contractors to restore the damage Victoria's renovations had caused, his hands-on involvement serving as both apology and redemption for his initial support of her fraud. Cordelia coordinated with 3 different women's organizations to identify the first residents, while Jasper's financial contributions ensured the facility could operate without charging rent to women who were already struggling financially. "Elena," Dr. Rivera said as we watched the moving process, "Harrison would be incredibly proud of what you've created here. This house has gone from being a symbol of family division to representing everything positive about second chances and community support." The first resident was Maria Santos, a 38-year-old mother of 2 who'd left an abusive marriage with nothing but a suitcase and her determination to build a better life. As she carried her few belongings up the same staircase where Victoria had once posed for her triumphant social media photos, I felt the house's energy shift completely. "Thank you for believing that women like me deserve beautiful spaces while we're rebuilding," Maria said, tears in her eyes as she looked around the restored living room. "I've been staying in shelters for 3 months, and everyone keeps telling me I should be grateful for any roof over my head, but this feels like home." The other residents included Jennifer Walsh, a recent divorcee whose husband had hidden assets to avoid alimony payments, and Patricia Chen, an elderly woman whose adult children had tried to force her into a nursing home to gain control of her property. Each woman carried stories of being dismissed, excluded, or told their needs didn't matter, experiences I understood intimately. The most meaningful moment came when Blake approached me during the welcome dinner we'd organized in the dining room where Victoria had celebrated her fraudulent inheritance. "Elena, I need to say something I should have said months ago. Victoria convinced us that you were weak, that you couldn't handle family responsibilities, that you were somehow less important because you married into the family instead of being born into it." His voice carried genuine remorse. "But watching how you've handled this entire situation, your strength, your grace, your generosity, I realize you're the strongest person in our family. You always were." Cordelia nodded in agreement. "We spent 31 years treating you like an outsider when you were actually the person who best understood what Harrison valued: loyalty, kindness, and putting family first. Not blood family, but chosen family." That evening, as I walked through the house that had once represented my exclusion, but now symbolized inclusion for women who needed it most, I found a handwritten note tucked into Harrison's favorite reading chair. It was from Jennifer, one of our new residents. Thank you for showing us that belonging isn't about blood or birth circumstances. It's about creating spaces where everyone's worth is recognized. This house feels like what family should be. Standing in the doorway of what had once been Harrison's study, now converted into a computer center where residents could search for jobs and rebuild their professional lives, I felt his presence one final time. He'd protected me even after death, but more than that, he'd trusted me to transform our love into something that could heal others. Victoria's attempt to steal our legacy had ultimately created something far more valuable than she'd ever imagined. A home where women learned they didn't need anyone's permission to belong, least of all, their own.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.